and welcome to this special episode of the Wine Pair Podcast. I'm Joe, your sommelier of reasonably priced wine, and for this special episode, I am on my own, as my wine pairing partner in crime is busy making cakes for her Baby Cakes micro bakery, which, by the way, you can learn more about if you head over to her website, lovebabycakes.com. Today we are on our third interview in our series on Virginia winemakers, and today we are interviewing Corry Craighill of Septenary Winery, as well as her own label, Wound Tight. For a bit of background, when I was initially contacted about Virginia wine and winemakers, I was going to put all of the interviews together into one episode because we've been talking to a number of Virginia winemakers. But that felt like a bad idea once I started talking to the winemakers and getting their amazing stories. And you'll be able to hear why once you hear Corry's story. Now, Corry had a fairly roundabout path to get where she is today, but one of the things I was really thrilled about in her story was that she had the chance to not only meet Parr, whose wines I kind of am geeky about, but she worked a season in one of the wineries he's associated with just because she wanted to learn. I will also note that about 3 weeks before we spoke, that when we recorded this episode, Corry had just given birth to her first child, so I really can't thank her enough for taking the time to talk with us. And not only that, we spoke in August, so she was just getting into the busy harvest season, so new baby, harvest season, lots going on, and Corry still took the time to sit down and talk to us, so you don't want to miss this story, and you'll really enjoy it. But before we get to Corry, I want to do a quick orientation to what we usually do in our podcast, because many of you are probably here for the first time, and we are super happy to welcome you to our podcast tribe. In most episodes, what we do is we learn about, taste, and review 2 to 3 wines that are reasonably priced, which means under $25 each, and should be easy to find. However, for this special set of episodes on winemakers, we interview people who are actually involved in making wine, because part of what we want to do with our podcast is to educate ourselves and you on different aspects of wine knowledge in a fun, entertaining, and unstuffy way, and that's what we're trying to do today. And a small plug before we get to the interview with Corry: if you like what you're hearing or are interested in hearing our other regular episodes, please subscribe or follow our podcast so you can hear more, especially since you're only getting one half of the Wine Pair podcast in this episode. You can also go to our website, thewinepairpodcast.com, to send us a note or subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at the Wine Pair Podcast. And if you like what you're hearing, leave us a nice 5-star rating and review. We don't mind. But without further ado, let's head over to our interview with Corry Craighill. Hi, Corry, and welcome to the Wine Pair Podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You bet. Thank you for joining us and for being willing to share your story. We've had a lot of listeners who have asked us about Virginia wine. Like, can you do some more stuff on Virginia wine? And it can be challenging to find Virginia wine in our part of the country, but we are hearing more and more about it. And so this is giving us a great opportunity to learn more about Virginia wine and, most importantly, to learn about you. So should we just jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about your family background growing up, if wine played a role at all, and then how you ended up as a winemaker, and in particular, a winemaker in Virginia.
My family background is I'm from a small town in Virginia called Lynchburg, and just had a normal upbringing. I didn't grow up on a farm or anything. But as I got older, my dad is really into like California cabs, and he would always encouraged me to look at the label and, read the back of the label and look at the label and taste the wine and sort of see if you agree with what they said. And then going into college, I went to the University of Virginia, which is in the middle of one of the bigger wine producing regions in Virginia, which is the Monticello AVA. So my third year of college, I just needed a summer job. So I started working at a tasting room and really loved the people. It was either like kind of older people that were working for retirement, or it was really young people. And the tasting room manager and the assistant tasting room manager, I think the assistant, she was getting she was going for her diploma. And so I just remember she had us over for dinner, had a bunch of people from the tasting room over for dinner, and she made duck à l'orange from Julia Child's cookbook and paired it with a Petit Verdot from Jefferson, which is where I was working at the time. And not only did it get me out of the UVA bubble, and I would say was my first exposure to how wine it's not snobby, it brings people together. And so from there, after college, kind of same thing. I majored in religion and bioethics, and I thought I would just go to DC with, a bunch of my friends and get a job and at a desk. But when I thought about sitting at a desk, that just really turned me off. So I applied to a couple places around here. I really liked Charlottesville. So I ended up working at Blenheim Vineyards, and again, like fell in love with the people. The Kirsty, the winemaker, just always surrounds herself with great people. And at that year, 2011, there were a lot of young people, and it was just a really fun opportunity despite the very rainy vintage. And then from there, I again kind of a question mark of like what's next? What do I do next? So I went to Australia and just worked at one of those huge wineries. I worked midnight to noon, and I hated it. I was like so out of my league. I spent so many nights like picking up fittings and like staring at the moon. And that was some parts really great and some parts really super boring. And I felt very lost because I had graduated from a really great college with kind of no career in mind. And I thought I'd go down this road. And when I realized how much I truly despised what I was doing, I sort of came groveling back to Kirsty of like, wait a second, you showed me this really great opportunity. Why did I hate this so much? And she said, well, okay, why don't you work at this tiny place? So she connected me to another female winemaker in the valley of Virginia, so Shenandoah Valley, which is kind of more up and coming growing region, where I got to see the process start to finish. And I always joke like it's really understanding like the movement of liquid is very important in winemaking. And when you in Australia, that you couldn't see the tank, the grapes were so distant from the tank that it was really difficult to make that connection. Whereas when I was working at this tiny place, I mean, I think we did like 50 tons in that whole vintage. I got to see everything, and I learned to drive the forklift. I learned, truly how to inoculate, or how to, if there's a problem, how do you handle it? That was sort of the beginning. Actually, in that same vintage, we finished early here. So I ended up also going to Oregon in the same vintage. So I spent the first part in Virginia, the second part at Ponzi. Again, it was the common thread, I'd say, for pretty much my whole career has been the people. And the assistant winemaker there was just very interested in engaging the interns and educating the interns. And not only did I learn from him, but I also learned from the other interns. I remember the Italian guy that, we lived in a house with all the interns, but one of the Italian guys showed me like what a bush vine was. And I had never seen that before. He talked about his culture and how he grew up and how he found wine. And same with the Australian girl, like she came at it from a very different angle, but was just as passionate. So I'd say when I returned from Oregon, after having those two experiences separate from Australia, it really reinvited me into the industry. So when I got back, I was sort of full force of, all right, this is what I want to do. Now where do I go? So long story short, I ended up working part of the week for Matua King family and part of the week for Kirsty. So I was getting two brains in half the amount of time. I got to see two cellars, two winemakers' brains, two cellar operations, and then for harvest, really learn how to connect all the dots together once the grapes start coming in. And I did that for 2.5 years. They both, as the Charlottesville industry started to grow, their production started to grow. So actually, both of them sort of said, look, you either are going to work for me full time at this point, or you got to go. And when they said got to go, they meant go learn. So I left and I went to New Zealand, and then I went to France, and then I went to South Africa, and I was going to go to California, but I got a full-time head winemaking job in Loudoun County, which is probably Virginia's other biggest winemaking region. I knew how hard it was to make the leap from intern to cellar rat to assistant, assistant to head. So I really didn't want to pass up a real salary and also kind of a chance to make my own wine, my own decisions in a new region for me. I was really happy to be in Virginia, but it was good for me to be geographically separate from my two mentors so that I could make my own mark. And I spent 4 vintages up there before getting the opportunity to come back to Charlottesville. And then in 2020, I that was really appealing to me because it was closer to family. It was closer to where I grew up in my career. And I just was ready for something new. About 2 weeks before my first day was this giant frost. It wiped out our entire vineyard so there was no fruit for our 2020 vintage. So I actually ended up going to California, and I worked at Provenage, which is Raj Parr and Sashi Moorman's winery. To back up, in between my job in Loudon and my job at Septenary, I had gone to Raw Wine, the festival in New York. And I actually went to go taste. Well, I went because it was exciting and so many awesome producers, but I was really interested in La Garagiste from Vermont. That's whose wines I really wanted to try. I had heard of Raj Parr, but I didn't really know that much about him. So when I was in the America section of Raw, Raj was pouring his own wine and he was talking very technically, he was talking about the winemaking process. And so as I was asking him questions, and he was sort of like, are you in the industry? Because Raw, as I learned, is more for like front of house. And I didn't meet any other winemakers that were attending in the way that I was attending. He said, okay, I can tell you're interested. Why don't you give me your phone number and I'll call you when I'm done and I'll answer all your questions. And I was like, there's no way he's going to freaking call me. At the end of the event, he sent me a text. He said, come back and I'll pour my wine and I'll take my time and you can ask all the questions you want. And that's what happened. As soon as we were done tasting his wines, he kind of took me around to his friends and he didn't like introduce me really because I think he forgot my name at that point. But he was just the fact that I was like asking questions and asking these other people questions. He was like, okay, well, the guy from Lo-Fi and I are going to the Four Horsemen for dinner. Do you want to come? I was like, sure, hell yeah. If I can keep asking questions, then I'll come. And I ended up giving him and the guy from Lo-Fi a ride because I had driven and my dog was in the car. And Raj was like obsessed with my dog. He's an Australian Shepherd, which I think Raj has an Australian Shepherd now and probably no connection. But all that to say is like, he just opened my world of winemaking curiosity and just being available for questions. So fast forward back to Septenary, when we lost our fruit, I kind of and then it was COVID. So they had lost all of their interns. They couldn't bring any of their European interns over. So they were sort of scrambling for American interns. And I kind of reconnected myself to them and said, hey, like, are you looking for help still? If so, can I come out? And they said yes. As soon as I got out there, once again, like it was the people. Raj is awesome, don't get me wrong, but it was John and Claire and DJ and Sashi that I had never, to be honest, heard of. And like, Darren and just all these people that had built this community out there to create these wines that are so famous because of one person, but it's about the team that kept me engaged, at least. Just the exposure to the thought process and exposure to the wines and the food and the friends that we made. I mean, I ended up going to Claire's wedding. Claire is now the winemaker of Provenage. It's just, again, it's about the people. I did bring some Virginia wine out there and everyone was pretty skeptical, but everyone tried it with good faith, gave me feedback. And so that was kind of cool to expose my California friends to our small region, showing them that like we are making interesting wines over here and we're not just trying to copy California, because of course we can't, or copy, someone else. We're really creating something new and something different in Virginia. So it was really cool to share it with that community.
I just have to say, like, your story is pretty amazing. How many different sort of places, experiences, etc. you've had. I'm really impressed that you got to meet Raj Parr and spend time with him and go to his where he produces wine and work with his people. So that's amazing. But I can definitely see there is a through line. And you've mentioned it several times, but you talk about the people, but also I can see this through line of connection. You have this need to connect, and through that connection you learn. You lost that connection, for instance, to the juice or to the wine when you were in Australia, and you gained it back when you went to experiences in like Oregon, et cetera. And also this kind of interesting, maybe tangential, but I think about it because I'm a father, like this connection with your father and his love for California Cabernets. So a question for you is, with all the mentors and the people that you've met and the places you've been, how do you think those connections have sort of filtered through into the kind of winemaker you are, or the wines that you like or the wine style you like to make?
So I think it might have been Raj that said like he loves to be inspired. And I couldn't agree with that more. I feel like I tell Matu at Kingfin, I was like, I'm a really good number two. I like to work with people and I like to talk out these ideas and do them and just try them out. And I would say because I've been so many places and learned from so many people in different levels of experience. So, like I said, I learned from the interns, I learned from the assistant winemakers who are actually running the cellar, let's be real, in a lot of these places, and from the winemakers who are having to make these bigger overarching decisions. Watching all of them, how they make decisions, how they taste wine, how they talk about wine, I feel like I've tried to absorb that in all of my experiences. So when I'm making wine, I want people to be curious about the wine too. Whether that's I'm making wine for Septenary. So Septenary is the goal is to make very classic, consistent wines that show off the vineyard and show the vintage, but have this sort of air of sophistication. So we age all of our reds for at least 16 to 18 months. We do a lot of barrel fermentation, like with our Chardonnay and our Viognier. And our Sauvignon Blanc is very bright. The goal is, like I said, to be consistent in quality and to be able to talk about the process in a very streamlined way. Whereas I have a side project called Wound Tight, where the goal, it's a little bit the opposite of like, I have this idea of like a weird winemaking technique that I want to try, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out. And in both instances, I try to answer a question or to be curious, and I want those that drink my wine to be curious too. I think that's important, and it sparks conversation, and that's what wine's about.
So I often ask this question when I talk to winemakers about where they kind of lean on the art or science of wine. And what's interesting to me is I can see there's a artist in you. There's like a creative spark in you, this way that your curiosity, you want to learn, you want to bring new ideas. And so I totally can hear that when you're talking. But I'm curious, as a winemaker, and maybe this has changed over time or it's continuing to evolve. Do you think more about the art of wine or the science of wine, or is it a balance? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, of course it's a balance, but you have to understand the science in order to appreciate the art. I would say I was very lucky to work for both Kirsty and the two, because Kirsty has a science background. I think she majored in chemistry at UVA, but she went to UC Davis. And Matu also has a degree and is very, if he needs it, has a protocol to kind of fall back on. So I would say from both of my mentors, I learned a very scientific approach with artistic kind of layered into that. So again, understanding the science helps you become a better artist. Understanding the technique it helps you become a better artist. So I try to carry that with me of understanding the science. And I would say that's how I was able, working for them and having such a rapid education that was based in science. I mean, Kirsty, at the time, I was helping her run her lab. So I was learning, I wasn't just learning the numbers, I was learning why they were important. And that helped me out. To give an example, in New Zealand, we were sitting around the table, and this is a company where at the time it was started by the grandfather and then it was passed to the son, and however many years it had been in the family, and all the interns were sitting around having lunch, and the grandfather comes in and he said, okay, now go in a circle, tell me where you went to school. And everyone said their winemaking school, and I said the University of Virginia, and he was like, where is that? And I said, it's in Virginia. He said, and yeah, I don't think he knew where Virginia was. And he just said, how did you get this job? As in, like, you're not qualified. And I just remember being mortified because I am an introvert, and being called out like that was just, I could feel my face go hot. The assistant winemaker came up to me later and she was like, don't listen to him. He doesn't know. You deserve to be here. Like, we wouldn't have hired you if we didn't think you would be a good fit. And about 2 weeks later, the grandfather came up to me and he apologized and he said, I was wrong. Like, without like tooting my own horn, he was sort of like, you're a very good intern. Like, you have proven yourself in my eyes, I guess is how he felt. But I think, to answer your question about art versus science, having that baseline of science for me has helped me build my career and helped me become a better winemaker with an artistic approach.
Yeah, it's almost like it gives you the base knowledge, the background to be confident, and then you can kind of go from there. It's a very similar pattern with like musicians, etc. You dancers, you learn the basics, and then you kind of are able to go from there. So totally makes sense. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Virginia wine. You mentioned when you were in California, you brought some Virginia wines and there was some skepticism. I will say, again, like we are in Washington State. Washington State makes a lot of wine. Right by Oregon, you were in Oregon. Oregon makes a lot of wine. Not a lot of people know, especially on the West Coast of the United States. And obviously, as you learned outside of the United States, know much about Virginia wine. So what do you think makes Virginia wine special? And if you have any thoughts about like what might help it take off more?
So to me, what makes Virginia wine special, again, I'll go back to my common thread of community. I would say, after working both in Loudoun and in the Monticello regions, the inspiration I get just from my peers is vast. And maybe it's because I'm sort of this second, or I guess third generation of, I feel like I'm very much still learning. Everyone here is an open book, whether that's for a standard protocol or an experiment they're running or a wine that they're having trouble with, or a blend that they're not sure about. I think the experimentation and collaboration drive a better product and drive all of Virginia to be better. And a big example of that is the creation and success of the Winemakers Research Exchange, which started as a grassroots experimental roundtable and has grown into this state-funded, I think it's a nonprofit that is run by Joy Ting and Rebecca Rainbow, and they are doing an excellent job of facilitating these experiments. So the way it works is, if I, Corry, am a winemaker, I have an experiment, the research exchange will help me write a protocol to make sure the experiment is valid. They'll pay for the lab analysis. They will finalize and write up all of the results and share the wine, if there is a wine to be shared, at these winemaker roundtables. So I get feedback from my peers that is hopefully statistically relevant. So it's a great opportunity for us to share ideas, experiment on our wines, answer questions or have our questions answered that maybe our cellar is too small to answer. So I think what makes Virginia special is that we're all very open to each other's ideas. We all push and ask questions and support each other in our various winemaking styles. Back up to California, I remember when we were having dinner at Sashi's house, we were talking about Virginia wine, and I was saying to him, I was like, I don't understand why Virginia wine is not taken more seriously. Like, why are we not? We're making good wine. It's clean. It's interesting. We've got a story. We've got all the things that we're checking all the boxes. Why are we not on an international stage? And he said, I think he set me up because he knows I love Jura. And he said, take Jura, for example. That wine making area existed for hundreds of years before anyone knew about them, until some sommelier decided they were cool. You are mirroring that. You have to get the local community to support you and to think that you're great, just like they did in Jura. That local community supported them for all of those years. And so you have to get the recognition locally before you can expand nationally and internationally. And I thought that was really interesting because there is, especially being in Loudoun County, which is very close to Washington, D.C., we did a lot of surveys where people in D.C. had no clue that there was a wine region an hour away from them. And so I think the idea of having Virginia wine take off really needs to start. I've used the word grassroots already, maybe a couple times. One way that it could be successful is via the local community and having restaurants support our wineries and buying local wines. You know, there's a lot of farm to table restaurants here. So where the wine list isn't farm to table, the wine list is still France and Italy and California wines. And it doesn't have a very big representation of Virginia wines. I know that the Monticello area is really, that's a conversation that the trail is having in order to pique local interest and continue to market locally so that we can expand within Virginia on the East Coast into these bigger cosmopolitan areas and really gain faster traction.
That totally makes sense to me. And one of the things that I think is maybe an extra challenge, there is this pull, I believe, because of I call it the hegemony of like Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, like the big California wines sort of paint the palette of what people expect a wine to be, or the wines they expect to hear about. And Virginia is, in speaking to Virginia winemakers, I know Cabernet Franc is a big deal, but there's also wines I'd never heard of, like Chardonnay or Petit Manseng. And so I think you're right. I think the push is to get the local community to open up their minds and appreciate the local wines that Virginia makes, and to allow that to sort of help things bubble. And so I'm curious about your wines, like the wines that you make, and what you think you really enjoy making and really speaks to what Virginia can offer in terms of wine.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I make wine kind of in two very different boxes. So my bigger winemaking box is for Septenary. And I mentioned that the style that I make for them is very classic, Bordeaux style wines. We do a lot of red blends that age through the next vintage. The Sauvignon Blanc and Gruner are very bright. The Chardonnay, I want to have a bit of depth. So, and having good consistency year to year. Of course, there's vintage variation, but having a consistent style that I can talk about down to the tasting room or up to the tasting room, because they have incredibly difficult job of translating what I do to the customer. So it's important for me to have a style that is interesting but conversational and not too frou-frou. I want the wine to be enjoyable and, again, spark curiosity. We focus a lot on Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot to structure our reds. At Septenary, when I started, the focus was red blends. So I started making a single varietal Cab Franc because I think that Cab Franc is a standout in Virginia. And to me, it's important to have that single varietal showcased in our lineup. And then our other reds are all blends. So I wanted to create a personality for each of those red blends that again were consistent and that made it easily translatable from me to the tasting room and to the tasting room to the customer. So we have sort of a lighter red blend, and then a beefier, kind of oakier, showier, loud wine, and then we have our Manor, which is our most texture driven and our kind of our flagship wine. So my stamp for Septenary, I hope, is consistency in this classical style. And I hope that that's sort of my long game mark on this area, is that I can be known for creating just really solid wines for Septenary. And then on the other hand, the other winemaking box I have is very small, but it kind of scratches the itch of the curiosity that I was talking about. And not to say that I don't experiment with septenary wines of how to make them better, deeper, more textural, but with my Wound Tight side brand, that's the bigger question mark that I maybe ask myself every vintage is, how do I create interesting wines in a very different approach? So it's all, quote unquote natural. So I try not to add sulfur. I definitely don't add yeast. I try not to make any additions, basically. And I try to use winemaking techniques to manipulate the wine. And I know that's sort of taboo to say, but this project is about the winemaking. And so, for example, I have a wine called Little Light. It's a Sauvignon Blanc, and I take about 10% of the stems, I dry them, I wrap them in a cheesecloth, and then I steep them in the wine for about 10 days. And the goal is texture, and you're getting texture from the tannin and the stems. But the reason I put them in the cheesecloth is that I can remove them, because I don't want to over extract. I really just want to add some depth to the wine.
I love that you blend, again, like a lot of artistry, a lot of thinking through, experimenting, trying things. And I'm totally a believer in what you said earlier, which is collaboration, two brains, three brains, getting multiple brains on something is often the best way. It can slow things down, but it's often the best way to get really good products out or really good results. I love hearing about the different wines and the ways that you approach them. Was there one wine that you made or you have made that you were like, this is it? Like, wow, I did it. Was there some like kind of breakthrough for you?
Short answer, no, because I don't ever want to, be satisfied with a single wine. But I would say there have been benchmark wines that I've been excited about that came from different spots in my career. So I'll give two examples. One is in Loudoun County, I made this clone specific Chardonnay. And I had such a good relationship with the vineyard manager at that point. And it was another young female, and she was starting her career. And we both just fell in love with this block of Chardonnay, and I kept it separate through the winery, and we ended up bottling it separate. It was the first time I had felt like I could share my product with my now peers, my once mentors, now peers. I remember pouring it for Ben Jordan at a tasting at Market Street and being so nervous, but also excited. And he's so reserved. And I don't even quite remember what he said, but I just remember him kind of nodding his head and hopefully approval. And then the other wine I would say was for Septenary. To give a frame of reference, I started in 2020, and I'm just now seeing my red wines being released to the public, because we age our wines so long in barrel and in bottle. And I tasted the 2021 Cabernet Franc, which was one of my first reds that I made at Septenary, and just being so, again, the same feeling of, it was like being proud of your kid. I think I wasn't proud of myself. I was proud of, now that I have a kid, I can say that, of like, it just made, I'm smiling as I'm talking about it, it's just such of an accomplishment to put in all of that work during the growing season, during harvest, waiting all this time, babying your wine, making sure it even gets to bottle, and hoping, once it's closed under cork, you're sort of like, okay, go do your thing and hopefully you turn out okay. And yeah, I just remember being really excited about that wine. So, and now it's starting to make its way into the tasting room. So I'm excited to share it and to see other people's reaction.
I can hear the excitement in your voice, and I'm excited. I think a lot of our listeners are going to be excited to try your wines. And I do think that there is a great analogy to having children or like raising a child and then like go off into the world. I hope you do okay. I think that's
mine's very only 3 weeks old, so
yeah, for a listener
quite yet.
Yeah, for listeners out there, just so you know, I hadn't said this, but Corry just had a baby. So there's that too, in the midst of getting ready for harvest and all that kind of stuff. So my gosh, Corry, it's been just awesome talking to you. Love hearing about your journey, the passion you have for winemaking, and the people around winemaking and the people that you've met. Like I said, I'm excited to try your wines and try Virginia wines. So help our listeners find out how they can find your wines, learn more about you, etc.
If you're interested in Septenary, we have a website and an Instagram. We ship wines all over the country. We have a list of states that we ship to on our website. And of course, you can always come to the tasting room, where we have a really lovely view and our staff is awesome. So please come visit us. Charlottesville is a very fun place to visit. There's tons of restaurants and hiking and events going on. And then for Wound Tight, if you're really interested, also have a website, and that you can find in some of the shops around town here in Charlottesville. So yeah, I hope you don't enjoy my wine. There's tons of really awesome Virginia wines in this area and in Loudoun County.
Well, that's wonderful. And for listeners, if you're worried about memorizing all this information, we'll have it in our show notes, and I'll talk about it again at the end. But Corry, we want to try your wines. And I just, again, can't thank you enough for the time that you spent with us telling us your story. Really appreciate it. And best of luck to you. I'm not sure what, actually, I do know. Best of luck on being a new mom, and best of luck in this year's harvest.
Thank you. I'm going to need it for both, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to our interview with Corry. And again, you couldn't tell in our conversation, but Corry's little baby was sitting there with her. And so I'm not sure how she was so clear-headed and engaged in the midst of the new parent fog. She's kind of an amazing person. So good on her. Here's information about Corry and her wines, and we really hope you will take the time to search them out and other Virginia wines. And you can find these links in our show notes. If you go to this episode and you click on our show notes, you'll find the links. But the website for Septenary is septenarywinery.com. The email for Septenary is info@septenarywinery.com, and Septenary is spelled Septenary. The website for Wound Tight is woundtight.com. The email for Wound Tight is woundtightwine@gmail.com, and Instagram is woundtightwine. So thank you again. We hope you'll subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky, and visit our website at thewinepairpodcast.com, where you can reach out to us and sign up for our newsletter. And you can also reach out to me at joe@thewinepairpodcast.com if you want more information, especially if you have winemakers you think we should interview. And we look forward to hearing from you. But for now, it's time to go, and as we like to say, life is short, so stop drinking shitty wine. Bye-bye. In the garden of my imagination,